September 1666. It was an ordinary night in London. Tired people had retreated into their homes on the narrow streets, and the dim light spilling from the wooden houses illuminated the sidewalks. No one was aware of the impending disaster. That was until the flames began to rise from the bakery on Pudding Lane, a dark twist of fate. A spark, a moment, and the gates of hell opened over London. The flames turned night into day. At first, the fire was a danger that no one took seriously, but it spread so quickly that by dawn, almost the entire city was engulfed in flames. The wooden houses of London burned like torches, fueled by the wind, and clouds of smoke hovered over the city for days. Desperate people fled their homes, taking one last look at their memories lost in the flames before running away without looking back. But there was almost nowhere left to escape. As disaster enveloped London, one question echoed in everyone's mind: when would this fire stop? But this fire was not just the burning of a city, it was a catastrophe that would rewrite London's history and destiny. A city rebuilt, lives changed, and hopes for the future. Together we will explore what happened during those dark days, starting from that first spark on Pudding Lane and witnessing how London rose from the ashes. If you're ready, let's embark on a journey into the depths of this historic fire. London in 1666. Back then, the city was far from the modern metropolis we know today, with its wide streets and bustling life. It had narrow alleyways and wooden buildings leaning against each other, almost like a maze. Once you stepped into the heart of the city, the crowded streets felt like a heavy weight pressing down on you. London was a true commercial hub at that time. Goods from the Silk Road arrived on ships from Europe's most famous ports. But beneath all this activity was another reality: the city housed too many people, but lacked the sturdy infrastructure to protect them. The streets were narrow, dark, and filled with almost airless passages. Oh, those wooden houses. Most of the buildings were made of wood, and some were even covered with reeds. These structures were so close together that you couldn't walk from one house to another without jumping over. They seemed to be just waiting for a fire to ignite. The ground floors of the homes were typically filled with shops, while families lived in the cramped upper levels, many with no fire safety measures in place. Strangely enough, hygiene conditions in London at that time were far from pleasant. The sewage system was nearly non-existent, waste piled up in the streets, mixing with people's living spaces. The stench was so strong that sometimes it was hard to breathe. This was the grim reality of London, where the fire was looming. Economically, the city was a place where the rich and poor were sharply divided. Great fortunes had been made through trade, but the poverty filling the streets was equally striking. Merchants, laborers, craftsmen. Everyone had their own story, but they all shared the common thread of living in narrow, unsafe homes. The city was so crowded that it felt like every corner was overflowing with people. This chaos created by the dense population was practically an invitation for disaster in the event of a fire. Pre-fire London was beautiful, but just as fragile. Wooden houses, narrow streets, a crowded population. All of these factors came together to set the stage for a great catastrophe. Just before the fire broke out, the conditions in the heart of the city were like a powder keg. A tiny spark was about to start spreading through this chaos like a monster, changing London's history forever. Now imagine walking through those narrow streets, wandering in the shadows of wooden buildings, getting lost in the crowd of people. Can you picture the kind of disaster that was approaching in such an environment? The spark was close, and London's fate would never be the same again. Ah, my dear friends, imagine it's a calm September morning, and the narrow, cramped streets of London haven't yet been bathed in daylight. In the heart of the city, a humble baker named Thomas Farriner on Pudding Lane was probably planning to go about his usual daily routine. Who knows, maybe when he woke up that morning, he thought he would go to work, put his loaves in the oven, and at the end of the day, return home with a sense of peace. But sometimes life is so strange that a little oversight can change the course of history forever. That morning, a small fire starting in Thomas Farriner's bakery didn't just bake bread in one house, it was igniting London's fate on September 2nd, 1666. At first, no one might have noticed, but soon smoke began to rise. The fire spread within the house, quickly spiraling out of control. Just take a moment to think. How quickly a spark could grow amidst those narrow homes. The wooden buildings of Pudding Lane were practically ready to become torches. The closely packed, leaning structures allowed the fire to spread rapidly. And sadly, it was already too late to realize what was happening that morning. The fire quickly spiraled out of control. The conditions of the time had left London defenseless. Most structures were wooden, the streets were narrow, and there were no safety measures in place to stop the fire from spreading. And as if that wasn't enough, fierce winds swept through London that day. Those winds. It was as if hell itself was breathing down the city's streets. Each spark was carried off to the next building, growing the flames and allowing the fire to expand. As the wind hurled the flames from one end to the other, the fire rising from Pudding Lane began to engulf the entire city. The wooden buildings of the city were burning like the loaves in the ovens. Each house ignited the next, and every street was turning into a furnace. The reasons for the fire spreading so quickly are quite clear: the close proximity of the buildings at the time, the ease with which wooden structures ignited, and of course the strength added by the winds. The powerful winds blowing through London took the flames from Pudding Lane and brought about great devastation across the city. As people panicked and fled, the fire's power grew stronger with each passing moment. What started as a small blaze in Pudding Lane quickly became the beginning of a colossal disaster spreading throughout London. This fire didn't just start with flames rising from a bakery, it was like a harbinger of a disaster etched into the city's fate. The weather conditions at the time, the cramped living spaces, and the fragility of the structures, all combined to surrender London to the flames. Now think for a moment. How did that little spark in Baker Thomas Farriner's home swallow an entire city? Picture how those first flames on Pudding Lane carved into the heart of London, and how the people of the city yielded to this massive calamity. My dear friends. Now, let me take you deeper into that unforgettable day, to the part where the fire completely engulfed London. Just imagine, that little spark that ignited on Pudding Lane had spread throughout the entire city in just a few hours. On that brutal September day in 1666, London fell victim to the flames, almost turning into hell. The combination of wooden buildings, narrow streets, and fierce winds. All these factors accelerated the fire, allowing the flames to spread rapidly across every corner of London. The structures in the city were practically inviting the fire. The wooden buildings were like torches feeding the flames. These houses lined up in London's narrow streets were so close together that when one caught fire, the flames quickly jumped to the next. Those buildings. Each one held lives, memories, and cherished belongings that turned to ash in an instant. Everything inside the homes surrendered to the fire, while the wooden walls and roofs were consumed one by the flames. Not just the houses, but shops, churches, and warehouses couldn't withstand those horrifying flames either. My dear listeners, close your eyes and imagine. Visualize how the old London melted away right before your eyes. Of course, desperate attempts began to stop the fire. But those efforts were so weak and insufficient. London's infrastructure at the time lacked the capacity to fight the fire. There wasn't enough water in the city. No measures had been put in place to combat the flames, and the people didn't know what to do. Water wells were limited. There were no fire hoses, and with the limited resources available, It was almost impossible to control those massive flames. People tried to carry water in buckets, but it slipped away into the blaze. The flames were so enormous that a few drops of water wouldn't do a thing to stop them. Firefighting equipment at that time was almost non-existent. Trying to stop the fire with a few small tools and human effort felt like trying to tame a giant dragon. No matter how hard they tried, they were dwarfed by the flames. And then, think about the reactions of those desperate people. Chaos erupted in the city. Everyone poured into the streets, frantically running around, not knowing what to do to save themselves. The rich, the poor, everyone shared the same fate. Just take a moment to imagine running here and there with the fear of losing everything: your home, your belongings, even your loved ones. As the fire grew, Londoners desperately fled the streets, trying to save whatever they could. The screams echoing in the city mingled with the crackling of the flames. As people left their homes, they looked back in tears, watching everything burn to ashes. Some lost their belongings, others lost family members in the fire. London felt like a battlefield this time. The enemy wasn't an army, but the ruthless flames. The people of the city were struggling to stop the fire, but their futile efforts were dwindling. No action or intervention was enough to tame that enormous blaze. It was as if London had been abandoned to its fate that day. No matter what they did, the flames kept devouring the city relentlessly and mercilessly. In the midst of all this despair, the city was slowly burning to ashes. The fire reached every corner of the city, driving people from their homes and the streets. My dear friends, this fire was such a disaster that, as if the terror of the first day wasn't enough, by the time the third day arrived, London's fate had completely changed. The flames kept growing, reaching the city's most precious and sacred places. As the fire approached St. Paul's Cathedral, the symbol of the city, a deep sense of fear began to spread among everyone. Just imagine those centuries-old structures, holy places filled with prayers. All of them suddenly became targets of these massive flames. St. Paul was the heart of London. It represented not only the city's religious spirit, but also its cultural soul. But alas, dear listeners, even the stone walls of the cathedral couldn't withstand this fire. As the flames wrapped around the cathedral's great dome, the fire could be seen rising into the sky from all corners of the city. This was a symbol of London's demise. However, the fire didn't just stop at St. Paul's Cathedral. During those days, other iconic structures in London seemed to be left to their fate. As wooden buildings collapsed one by one, the more the fire grew, the deeper the panic sank into the hearts of the people. It wasn't just buildings that were burning. Hopelessness was sprouting in every corner of London. People didn't know where to run. There was no distinction between rich and poor. Each person shared the same fear, the same sense of helplessness. With the fire spreading rapidly, especially reaching these important landmarks, the streets were thrown into complete chaos. In a panic, Londoners grabbed their belongings and ran through the streets, transforming the city into a battlefield. But this battle was against an uncontrollable force of nature. Just think about it. London's most magnificent structures were devastated in a matter of days, and people were trying to escape to the other side of the river, leaving their homes and memories behind. At that moment, the people's eyes turned toward the royal family and the government. King Charles II and his team quickly sprang into action to intervene in the fire. But oh, what a difficult task this was. Government officials and soldiers tried their best, yet the fire was so vast and merciless that every measure taken seemed insufficient. The king ordered strict measures to be taken to regain control of the fire. Soldiers and volunteers worked to put it out, trying to create barriers by demolishing buildings in front of the flames. However, those enormous flames rendered every effort futile in an instant. The royal family and the government's attempts felt ineffective against the ferocity of the fire. By the third day, the fire had already destroyed many parts of London and left the people utterly helpless. No matter how hard the king and the administration tried, it was impossible to prevent the fire from spreading rapidly. The royal family was on site to intervene in the fire, but the fear within the people couldn't stop the chaos from escalating. The city was now in the grip of an uncontrollable disaster. Ah, my dear friends, it's not easy to describe the chaos and despair that swept through the streets of London during those days. By the third day, the fire had become so terrifying that all efforts to save the city were falling one after another into futility. Yet, the people of London and the government officials were determined to do whatever it took to stop the fire. This wasn't just any fire, it was a disaster that devoured the city like a monster, with no boundaries. Fighting these massive flames wasn't something that could be accomplished with just water and small interventions. One reason the fire was so intense was the abundance of wooden buildings in London. The wood was practically eager to burn, aided by the wind. That's why officials decided to demolish buildings to halt the fire's progress. While this move seemed like a desperate attempt, it was one of the most logical strategic steps to take under the circumstances. By sacrificing certain buildings to the fire, they would create controllable fire lines. The royal officials quickly sprang into action to implement this plan. King Charles II and his advisors were trying to prevent the fire from spreading any further into the most dangerous areas. Imagine for a moment the struggle of thousands of people working together to build a barrier against the fire. As Londoners used whatever they could find to fight the flames, soldiers and workers were tearing down buildings one by one to stop the fire's advance. The sounds of pickaxes and hammers echoed through every corner of the city. Yet still, the flames kept pushing forward, overcoming every effort. The fight against this disaster wasn't just a physical battle, it was also a struggle for existence against the forces of nature. During this relentless fight against the fire, the witnesses of the time shared detailed accounts of what they experienced. Notably, Samuel Pepys and John Evelyn recorded the horror in their diaries. Reading Pepys' words makes you feel the terror of the fire deep in your bones. He witnessed the destruction of St. Paul's Cathedral and experienced the panic in the streets firsthand. Evelyn, in his diary, described how London turned into hell, detailing people's frantic escapes and the royal family's helplessness. These two remarkable individuals show us that the fire was more than just a disaster for the common people, it was an event that destroyed the soul of a city. Ah, dear listeners, as you lose yourself in the words of Pepys and Evelyn, you're almost transported back to those horrifying days in London. However, despite all the destruction and chaos, the fire was eventually brought under control. After days of struggle, the determination of the people and officials allowed the fire to be contained at some point. But this victory didn't come easily. The effort, sacrifice, and lives lost in trying to stop the fire were etched into London's memory. In the end, the fire was extinguished, but the city had lost a significant part of itself. Ah, my dear friends, the silence that followed this disaster underscored the sheer power of the fire once more. Ah, my dear friends, by the fourth day, the flames that had ravaged London had finally begun to slow down. But this lull didn't mean the fire was over. The smoke rising from every corner of the city served as silent witnesses to the destruction left behind. On the morning of September 6th, the people of London woke up to find their city in ruins. As far as the eye could see, there were collapsed buildings, burned streets, and memories lost beneath ashes. London was no longer the London they once knew. That vibrant, bustling city was now just a pile of rubble and ash. The fury of the fire had nearly remade the city, covering London's spirit in soot. That morning, the intensity of the fire had finally broken. The wind dying down had rewarded the efforts of those trying to stop it. But the wound opened in the heart of London was too deep to heal. News spread quickly that the fire was out, but within the people remained the sorrow and emptiness left by the lives that had been shattered. The scale of the destruction was unprecedented. The collapse of St. Paul's Cathedral and the complete incineration of wooden homes. All those magnificent buildings had succumbed to the wrath of the flames over the course of those days. Was it only the buildings? No. The screams echoing through the streets, the lost lives and shattered hopes. All of these had been consumed in the fire's ashes. As the fire calmed, survivors slowly began to emerge across London. People poured into the streets to see what remained. Oh, that sight. My dear listeners, how difficult it is to describe. Among the ruins, people walked through the wreckage, scanning the piles left of their homes with eyes filled with shock and a heavy silence. The horror of the fire had left behind only stone, ash, and broken memories. The city center looked like a battlefield. People didn't know how to cope with this new reality. Every street, every corner that once bustled with life was now ruled by silence. The royal family and officials sprang into action to intervene in this situation. London had to be rebuilt, but the process would be anything but easy. Reconstructing the city after the fire and bringing the people back together would take years. Ah, my dear friends, the pain of those days would never be fully forgotten. It would remain as a wound etched into the heart of London. This fire had not only burned buildings, but it also turned the city's spirit to ash. Ah, my dear friends, the end of the Great Fire of London didn't just mean that the flames had been extinguished. The devastation it left behind was too deep for the city to ever fully recover from. The number of buildings, businesses, and sacred churches that had been destroyed was staggering. London's skyline, once bright and lively, was now reduced to ruins. Structures that had represented decades of labor, art, and culture had fallen victim to the fire's wrath. Each piece of rubble symbolized a part of London's history and social life. The material destruction caused by the fire didn't just stop at the wreckage of buildings, even worse. Tens of thousands of people were left homeless. Just think about it. My friends, people who once walked through streets filled with joy were now struggling to survive in tents or shelters. Families had been torn apart, their belongings lost, and all their hopes turned to ash. The devastation threatened not just the buildings, but the very spirit of humanity. Tears shed at every corner, the losses and the sense of helplessness were the bitter truths of life during that time. The economic impacts were felt just as deeply. The businesses, shops, and workshops in the city had vanished, leaving many craftsmen and merchants without work. London had once been the heartbeat of trade. Now it was a mere shadow of its former self. Unemployment and poverty were rising every day, leaving people increasingly desperate. Workers struggled with the stress of not being able to earn a living, and even those who survived were fighting for food and shelter. Despair wrapped itself around the city, pitting people against each other and seriously shaking the social fabric. The spiritual effects of this destruction presented a different challenge. The sense of community was damaged and trust among people had eroded. Londoners, who once worshipped and celebrated together, now lived in deep sorrow. The fire wasn't just a physical destruction, it also shook the feelings of solidarity and togetherness among the people. The city had lost not only its buildings but also its history, culture, and its very people. Ah, my dear friends, this fire will be remembered as one of the greatest tragedies in human history. With its memories and the pain it caused, it will forever hold a place in the hearts of people. Ah, my dear friends, while the people of London were struggling to cope with the devastating effects of the fire, another chaos erupted as they searched for someone to blame. Even before the flames were extinguished, accusations began flying among the people. Which group, belief, or lifestyle could be the cause of this disaster? Catholics, in the highly polarized society of that time, were the most targeted group. Many didn't hesitate to blame Catholics, believing that a hidden hand was behind this destruction. Rumors spread like wildfire, and everyone had something to say. Some even started to see the fire as part of a conspiracy by foreign traders in the city. Another frequently heard rumor was that the fire was an assassination attempt. But dear friends, the speculation about the cause of the fire stemmed not only from desperation but also from a quest for understanding. The debate over whether the fire started accidentally or was deliberately set divided the people of the city. Some argued it was an accident, claiming it began in the bakery of a simple baker named Thomas Farriner. Others believed there was a deeper reason that overshadowed the suffering and losses people experienced. These discussions only fanned the flames of gossip, creating an atmosphere of mistrust and paranoia in the community. In the aftermath of the fire, debates filled with accusations and attempts to find answers continued to rage across London. Everyone was looking for a scapegoat, trying to make sense of who was responsible for this great calamity. Beyond merely seeking accountability, some who believed this disaster was a turning point began to reassess their views on the anti-Catholic sentiments of the time. In fact, not knowing the source of the disaster left people even more unsettled. This anxiety led many to harbor unnecessary hostility. The chaos created by the fire symbolized not just a blaze but also a time when the darker sides of human nature flared up. Ah, dear friends, this fear and chaos following a disaster was another reality that changed history. Although the fire had been extinguished, the insecurity and debates it sparked would continue to leave deep marks on the heart of London. Ah, my dear friends, in those days when the ashes of the fire were still fresh, the people of London began to dream of rebirth after the devastation. With the fire finally out, every individual in the city was filled with a desire to be part of a renewal. It was during this time that a brave man named Christopher Wren stepped into the spotlight for the rebuilding of London. As an architect, Wren took on the monumental task of not just reconstructing the city's appearance, but also its spirit. Believe me, this was far more than just a simple construction project. It was a desire for life from a community rebuilding upon its burned dreams. The fire had reduced many architectural marvels to rubble, and the narrow streets lined with wooden buildings had once wrapped the city in a labyrinthine embrace. But now, in the wake of this terrible disaster, London's face was about to change with an innovative plan. Wren proposed broad streets in the city layout, aiming to minimize future fire hazards. No longer would London be remembered for its complicated, cramped streets. Instead, it would be known for its spacious avenues and sturdy stone structures. These new buildings would not only provide aesthetic appeal but would also lay a solid foundation for London's future with their resilience. The measures taken during this process would be a critical step toward ensuring that a similar disaster would never happen again. And this is where the reconstruction of one of Wren's greatest masterpieces, St. Paul's Cathedral, came into play. This cathedral would become not just a place of worship, but also a symbol of London's rebirth. Wren embraced the Baroque style of the time in the cathedral's design, resulting in a magnificent structure. Every stone, every ornament represented the pain the people of London had endured and their desire to rise again. The construction of the cathedral brought together the hopeful gazes of the city's residents, helping to build a spirit that would never again be toppled. Ah, my dear friends, Christopher Wren and his visionary approach marked a turning point that changed London's fate. Amidst the ashes of the fire, there were the budding sprouts of innovation and rebirth. London was now breaking free from the dark shadows of its past and moving toward a bright future. Ah, my dear friends, with the fire finally extinguished, London's rebirth from the ashes wasn't just about physical rebuilding, it was also a sign of profound social and cultural changes ahead. The fire was not just a disaster, it marked a turning point. This great destruction forced the people of the city and England to open the doors to a new order and a new understanding of safety. In the aftermath of the fire, safety measures began to increase along with the construction of new buildings. Structures were now designed with a focus not only on aesthetics but also on durability. First, stone structures were promoted to replace wooden buildings. The narrow streets of the city were widened to help prevent a potential fire from spreading rapidly. Fire departments were strengthened, and training on fire safety began. Now, strict regulations and inspections were being enforced in London to ensure that the same mistakes would never be repeated. These new measures greatly contributed to the safety of the city and the psychological comfort of its residents. People not only left behind the horrific memories of the past, but also reignited their hope of living in a safe environment once again. These safety measures after the fire formed the foundation for London's cultural and economic revival. Although many people lost their homes and workplaces, they came together to fight for a common purpose. New job opportunities emerged, trade was revitalized, and this revival brought about economic growth. The city hosted many cultural events, allowing people to find morale and reconnect. Art, music, and theater became vital elements that nourished the spirit of the city during this new era. However, the effects of the fire didn't just stop at the physical and economic levels. It also led to a significant transformation in British society and politics. The community reinforced its sense of solidarity after the fire. People came together, setting aside past class divisions to form a shared identity. This new awareness created by the fire resonated in the political arena as well. During the city's rebuilding process, the public's demands began to be taken more seriously. Local leaders were compelled to develop new policies that considered the safety and needs of the people. The fire was not just a disaster, it acted as a catalyst for change. Dear friends, just as every pain offers a lesson, London reshaped itself by learning many lessons from this fire. The winds of change that followed the disaster strengthened the city's spirit and transformed it into a community looking forward to the future with greater hope. While the memory of the fire remains fresh, London was now moving forward, leaving the darkness of the past behind and heading toward a brighter future. My dear friends, as we look back now, we see that the Great Fire of London was not just a disaster, but also left behind a profound historical legacy. This fire became a significant turning point, not only for London, but for the whole world. While it brought about deep changes in the city's structure, social relationships, and understanding of safety, it also reinforced the spirit of solidarity among people. The aftermath of the fire shaped the modern face of London that we see today. In the wake of the destruction, the community coming together and showing solidarity wasn't limited to just physical reconstruction. People shared the pain of losing everything they had. Those left homeless received help from their neighbors, and those who lost their businesses banded together to create new opportunities. This sense of solidarity forged deep connections, not just during the rebuilding process, but also in human relationships. Londoners realized the importance of supporting each other in tough times, which enhanced the community's unity and resilience. The Great Fire of London also solidified its place in European and world history. The fire prompted other cities to reassess their safety measures, tighten building regulations, and be more vigilant about fire safety. The precautions taken after the fire helped prevent similar disasters in other cities. After experiencing such great suffering, London became a model on an international level. The fire became a symbol not just of urban disaster, but of the stories of solidarity and rebirth among societies, governments, and individuals. In conclusion, dear friends, the Great Fire of London is remembered not just as a moment of destruction on the historical stage, but also as an event symbolizing humanity's power of solidarity and rebirth. The societal changes, safety measures, and urban planning developments that followed the fire shaped the spirit of present-day London. The traces of the fire are still there, but they represent not only the losses but also the symbols of resilience and renewal. Having experienced this pain, London continues to look to the future with hope, never forgetting the lessons of its past. My dear friends, as we slowly approach the end of this incredible story, I want to remind you of the deeper meaning behind this great disaster. The Great Fire of London was not just a fire, it symbolizes the determination of people, the spirit of solidarity, and the ability to rise again. This fire showed us how vital the process of rebuilding is after destruction. While the fear and panic during the fire temporarily froze the heart of London, the subsequent spirit of unity and solidarity reignited the courage of the people. The stories of the architects, community leaders, and ordinary people who rebuilt London after the fire remind us that hopeful new beginnings are possible after every disaster. This event is not just a part of the past, it also serves as a source of inspiration for the future. As London carries the scars of this great fire, it keeps the memory of that solidarity alive in every street and every building. The lessons learned after the fire serve as an example for other cities and have led to revolutionary steps in fire safety. And now, as this story comes to a close, let's not forget that history is not just a record of events. History is a roadmap that helps us understand who we are, where we came from, and what kind of society we want to build in the future. As we carry the traces of the Great Fire of London, we should draw inspiration from this story and integrate solidarity and courage into our own lives. My dear friends, as history shapes us with its lessons from the past, we must continue to build our future in the light of that knowledge. This story ends here, but remember, history flows like an ever-moving river. The past is a reflection that shapes the future. So now, let's find the courage to face today's challenges by recalling this precious story. Thank you, dear friends. Until we meet again in the next tale, may we lose ourselves in the depths of history.